I'd like to briefly summarize at a high level what we're talking about when we use the term mDL, or mobile driver license. I'd also like to dispel some common misconceptions. The issuing authorities in the US and Canada are where the functional needs came from, and then I'd like to round out the overview by providing a peek into the work that is happening around the planet. Next slide, please. In the simplest terms possible, an mDL is the electronic data carried on a mobile device that represents a physical DL credential that would have been issued to that individual. To put it slightly differently, an mDL is trustable data that proves someone is who they claim to be, can prove they're being bound to that trustable data, and has the associated privileges. In the case of a driver license, the privilege to drive. When asked what does an mDL look like, the answer is you can't really see it because it's the zeros and ones being carried, transmitted, and verified. Next slide. What we've struggled with from the very beginning with our work is the inclination to render a photo or image of a credential and then subject the relying party communities to the roulette of whether what they're seeing is trustable. Cutting to the chase, we didn't want to perpetuate the issues we have in the physical credential realm, much less make the situation even easier for those with the intent to commit an ID-related crime. Next slide, please. The functional requirements are really the what an mDL is, and my fellow panelists will be diving deeper into this as well as looking at the how. At the outset, we've had both security and privacy in mind. Far better to integrate those into every step along the way than to finish the work and then wrestle with how do you make things secure and privacy-centric. Next, mDLs need to confirm the holder's identity. They also need to convey whatever the associated privileges are. In this case, to drive. They also need to be trusted. They need to be interoperable. From the very beginning, the jurisdictional folks that led the way in this knew that if they created mDL solutions that only work within their own jurisdictions, that it would not be accomplishing what they'd set out to do. Not only should it work outside of the issuing state or province, ideally it will work anywhere around the world. They need to promote data minimization. The holder should not have to overexpose their personally identifiable information. They should be in control of how much information they release and to whom. mDLs will ultimately work both in person-to-person scenarios as well as a person to a kiosk, online, or other unattended scenarios. mDL holders need to be able to remove the credential, and issuing authorities need to be able to keep the credential attributes updated. For example, a change of address, a change in status, the addition or removal of an endorsement and/or restriction. And lastly, they need to be able to work without an online capability. Next slide, please. The mDL standardization has been going on for many years, and a significant list of countries have been actively participating. The heart of the work has really been done inside of ISO SE 17 WG10. In the last couple of years, the ISO committee that's working on mobile identity, which is SE 17 WG4, has joined forces and has taken up the mDL use case as their first primary area of focus. Next slide, please. From a motor vehicle authority perspective, I was quite pleased that there are so many other geographic regions that are working cooperatively on aligning to the work of ISO. Counterpart associations in both Europe and Australia have mirror activities to the ones inside of AMVA and have been coordinating on proofs of concept, interoperability tests now for the past 2 years. Next slide, please. We've known that there were benefits from a liability perspective to not have to physically interact with a device for an mDL transaction. Only in the recent past has it become clear and even explicitly stated that due to the risk of virus transmission from handling and exchanging a physical credential, the benefits of mDL are now even more anticipated. I'd like to now turn things over to Chief McCaskill of the Florida Highway Patrol. Sir?
Thank you, Jeff. This is Mike McCaskill. I am the Chief Administrative Officer of the Patrol and have been working on this project actually since 2012 when the Electronic Identification Working Group was established. Next slide, please. So for many, many years, jurisdictions have spent millions of dollars to secure the data on physical credentials using overt, covert, and forensic card security features that are designed to prevent tampering and show if a card has been compromised. The physical card has been a great asset for proof of identity and driving status, but there are some limitations, and Jeff alluded to some of those just a few minutes ago. Physical cards are only as accurate as they were the day they were issued and left the office. Changes in identity information, i.e. address or driving restriction changes, are not reflected on the card unless the holder obtains a replacement. For the holder to prove identity, they must hand over the card that has all, and I say again, all of their identifying information, which in many cases is scanned or copied for proof. When jurisdictions began to gather requirements for the mDL, we wanted to ensure that what we settled on was privacy-centric and had built-in data protections and was an improvement over the current physical card. So that means that any requirement that we published must adhere to the privacy of the mDL holder, as well as the security of the data used to provision the mDL. Privacy of the mDL holder includes the inability to track their mDL usage. You should not be able to determine when the mDL was used nor where it was used. And for an example, I'll use myself. You shouldn't be able to tell that Mike McCaskill used his mDL to prove his age at his local liquor store 5 times this week during the COVID-19 issue. That's just something that we can't have. Privacy also includes the holder's ability to only release the data they wish to release, as Jeff mentioned before. Only releasing the information that I am over 21 and authorized to make the age-restricted purchase doesn't give the relying party, the liquor store clerk in this case, any more information than they need to complete the transaction. No personal data was released, minimizing the possibility for identity theft or fraud. Next slide, please. Interoperability was also a very important piece of this. With the physical card, interoperability is not an issue since the acceptance of the driver license or identification card is a visual process. You compare the photo on the license to the person standing in front of you and make your determination as to whether or not that is that person's credential. This is accomplished by solutions following the ISO 18013 Part 5 standard. And interoperability is not just in particular jurisdictions, but across all jurisdictions, both in the US and globally. The credential must be trustable. The relying parties must be able to trust the mDL. Trust that the mDL was issued by the issuing authority. Trust that the data is authentic and can validate the data with the issuing authority if needed, if the need arises. And these would be in cases where you have high dollar transactions in a bank or purchases of controlled substances in a pharmacy. The mDL also has to be able to work offline. This is especially important in a law enforcement arena where law enforcement are in remote areas without cellular coverage. There are instances where either the mDL or the reader are not connected to a network and therefore cannot validate data with the issuing authority. In these cases, the ability to validate that data, that the data was issued to the holder by the issuing authority, is still a main requirement. And then we also have to have the ability to manage the mDL remotely. The data must be updated in real time, and any changes to an identity or driving privilege must be updated to the mDL when they are changed in the system of record. Therefore, we have the most up-to-date information sitting on the mDL at all times. Jurisdictions must have the ability to remove an mDL from a device if needed also. In the circumstance where an mDL was obtained under fraudulent circumstances, the jurisdiction needs to be able to remove that mDL upon notification. Next slide, please. in conclusion of all this, the requirements are the required elements for an mDL. If any one of these were left out of an mDL solution, it can't really be considered an mDL. Now I'll turn it over to David to talk about the more technical components of the mDL requirements.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Keltz with GET Group North America and a longtime member of the ISO 18013-5 working group. Go ahead, Kathy. So Mike and Jeff have done a great job of setting up what the jurisdictional requirements were, what the sort of North American requirements were, and what the global requirements were for a mobile driver's license. So I want to dig into how it is, what are the mechanisms that fulfill those requirements, and how it is that you can trust an mDL. And I think trust is the key issue from the perspectives of all of the participants in an mDL transaction. This is not an image rendered on the face of the phone, and it's not a picture of the license taken. There's too many ways and too many tools that allow you to create, false images and to show them to somebody on the screen. In the physical card world, we have security features that are on a license, and when you are handed a license and you touch it and look at it, you can sort of get an idea of the security features on there. And even still, many of those security features can be replicated in false IDs. So as we go into the mDL world, we have to move away from that particular usage and take a look more at, as Jeff had said, so the electronic data being trustworthy and presented in a way that the verifier can trust. Go ahead. So how do we implement that? The mechanism by which the ISO 18013-5 standard was created is that through that ISO Working Group 10, there's started and it has grown to well over 50 companies. Essentially, the issuers electronically sign the data elements to move them to the device of the consumer. So this is, you can think of this as an electronically signed document or individual electronically signed elements that we've placed into the citizen's control. And the relying parties need multiple ways that they can obtain the data so that it fits their business flow. And then also they need to be able to trust that data. You need to verify that the data came directly from the issuing authority. So all of these things come together in this ISO 18013-5 standard. And I'll sort of explain some of the mechanisms. You can go ahead to the next slide. Key thing here is that a mobile driver's license sort of creates an ecosystem. There's a lot of talk about identity ecosystems. This essentially creates ones. The issuing authority signs this data as being valid and provisions it to the citizen's mobile device. The citizen gains control of that, and the mDL holder or the user, and they have services that they want to request that require them to have a government-backed identity. The verifiers essentially read and validate that data similarly to how they do with the physical cards. They need to know that this came from an issuing authority. And they use that to sort of lower their risk or to fulfill compliance that they have. And they also may have a relationship with the issuing authority. So as we go to the next sets, as the next things kind of phase into these slides, think back to the list of functional requirements that Jeff had on his slide and the list of jurisdictional needs that Mike put on his slides, because I can kind of show you how each of these is met by the trust mechanisms in the ISO standard. Go ahead. So the issuing authority uses a private key to electronically sign each of the data elements in the mobile driver's license. So everything that you see on the face of the card, in addition to some management information, is electronically signed by the issuing authority and then provisioned down onto the citizen device. They use the private key essentially to sign that, and protecting that private key is essential to the security and trustworthiness of the system. Sorry about that. It's homeschool time. The public key then for that signature becomes available. That is the signer certificate that the issuing authority makes available. This can be freely distributed, and this is how the verifiers actually check the signatures on the data. Go ahead. These signer certificates in groups can be distributed in what's called a master list. These master lists can be assembled by issuing authorities, by associations. You can get them from vendors. These master lists represent a collection of public keys from trusted issuers. Go ahead. Can you go ahead to the next slide, to the next piece? So then the ISO standard, the ISO standard specifies what these master lists look like and what the signer certificates look like, and then also how the mechanisms, plural, for how data goes from the citizen device, from the mDL holder, to the reader device. And there are multiple of these mechanisms. There's NFC, there's Bluetooth for short-range distance, there's Wi-Fi aware, and then there's also, in this, as you can see at the leg on the right-hand side here, there's what we call an online model. So if the devices are online, then the verifier can go and request from an API at the issuing authority to get the up-to-the-date information after the citizen approves that release. Now, if the devices are offline, then the standard supports these multiple mechanisms for data to be transmitted over the local channel. In either case, the verifier can use the public keys from a master list to verify that the data that they've received is intact, has not been altered along the way, and that it came directly from the issuing authority that they expect. And they can verify each of those things, put that little check mark, and run the transaction. You can go ahead to the next one. So when the ISO Working Group 10 was looking at how we fulfill the different use cases, we gathered together a list. It's really a subset of the things that we do with driver license and ID documents, daily or over the course of our lives. We had certain things that we wanted to be in scope, certain things that we wanted to sort of move quickly to the market with, and then other things that were future planned items. Key to any of these is what was said before, selective release of information or data minimization. This is the holder having control and the holder being able to approve the release of only those data elements that are required for any of these use cases above. So for instance, as with an age-restricted item, you don't necessarily need to know the name or the address of the person who's there purchasing. You simply need to know that it came from an issuing jurisdiction, that it's unexpired, that their age is over 21. So the standard allows for that minimization, allows for that consent to sharing the data at the request and release of the data. So there are certain things that are in fact out of scope in the ISO in this particular standard. Provisioning, deleting, or updating the data, while those are jurisdictional needs, they're not standardized in ISO 18013. They will be standardized in the future through another ISO standard 23220. But in day one, in this first release, they're not. That ability to show the driving privilege is not trustworthy, is not something that will be standardized, short of there being sort of a trusted screen execution environment, similar to the trusted computing execution environments, similar to being a trusted screen where nobody can kind of break into what's written on the screen. That will not be standardized. And then, so then we looked at, okay, all of these use cases, we can fulfill all of these use cases with what's called day one of the ISO standard, which includes the features that I talked about on the previous slide. The ability to use NFC or QR code to kick off a transaction, the ability to use NFC or Bluetooth or Wi-Fi aware for an offline transmission of the data, or the ability to use a web API or in fact OpenID Connect for the online. We can fulfill each of these use cases using those transmission mechanisms. And we've scoped this so that in the first day one release, it is expected that these will be attended operations. There will be a person who can take a look at the photo, see that the photo was signed by the issuing authority, and verify the identity of the person to that. We anticipate in day two being able to move towards an sort of unattended operation, being able to move towards having automated user authentication. And as well, the sort of distance is scoped down to those initial two NFC tap and the QR code reading that restricts the distance at which these can start down a little bit. And those are the concepts by which we're able to roll out this day one of the ISO standard, which is available now. You can download versions of it now, and then also the as we're working on the day two, and that day one version should be finalized as a final international standard this year. Since you can fit these different transactions into a standardized transmission mechanism, and you can trust the data, mDL can essentially start to revolutionize customer service for these identity transactions. And when you're able to distance these transactions, as Jeff alluded to really at the beginning, we can start to address some of the contactless identity transactions that are needed now in this sort of post-COVID-19 as we open up society. And the question is then, okay, is your company ready to rely on a mobile ID and to sort of reap the benefits of this new way of interacting with your customers for age-based transactions or identity-based transactions where a official government ID is required? You can go ahead to the next one. So with that as the basis, I'm just going to introduce you to Webinar 2. Webinar 2 essentially takes what I just described, right? Why you can trust, why there is cryptographic proof of the identity document, and sort of what we've covered in Webinar 1. We'll dig a little bit more into the mechanisms, online, offline, and the different data transmission that are used in the mDL standard, and then what that means for interaction modes and how you develop out your use case. How can you look at all of the requirements for your particular use case of how you want to consume ID? How can you break those down? There are tools that STA has put together, a template that we will release for defining these use cases. And Webinar 2 will cover essentially those interaction modes, the use cases, how you can use the use case template to define how you want to accept an mDL. And then as well, we'll have some relying parties with particular needs who can describe what their needs are so that you have examples of how to develop your acceptance of an mDL. I think that I turn it back to Randy. At this point, you can see there's a link down at the bottom, and it will also be in the follow-up emails so that you can register for Webinar 2.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you also to Mike McCaskill and Jeff Slagle for their excellent presentations today. We do have a few minutes that we're going to take some questions from the attendees, but before we do that, if we could please go to the next slide, I'd like to bring up some additional information that's available to our audience after today's webinar. So I want to point out that we have some web resources that you can find additional information about mobile driver's licenses. The first one is the published white paper and frequently asked questions document that we released recently on the mobile driver's license and ecosystem that formed the basis for this webinar. We also have a knowledge center where we have additional content available. And I want to refer you to the AMVA Mobile Driver's Licenses Resources website, as well as the International Standards Organization's specifications for personal identification mobile driver's licenses. That's available for those of you who are in the technology side that want to understand more deeply about what's been presented today regarding the day 1, day 2 sets of specifications. Also, you'll be able to go to the mdlconnection.com website, which is active right now, and we will be announcing in a major press release to the public next week. If we go to the next slide. So I'm going to start the Q&A session now. I'm also showing here the contact information for all of us today. So if there are additional questions that you'd like to submit after today's session, you can reach out to us individually or to myself, and I'll distribute that to the group. So we're going to start with a question from the beginning of the presentation that I think Jeff would be best able to handle. From an economic point of view, will an MDL be cheaper for a government than the corresponding physical document? And I think that gets into the whole issue about will MDLs actually be replacing the physical document. Jeff, can you answer that?
Yes, Randy, thank you. And thank you for the question. I think it's important to keep in mind that at the outset for the issuing authorities, at no point was it assumed that they would be at a fork in the road and having to make a choice in their programs on do they continue doing physical documents or do they start doing these MDLs. Every single conversation that took place and continues to take place is one where, in addition to the physical documents, people are looking at programs to start doing MDLs and at the option of their customer, not as a mandate. And so it really is not being treated as or looked as a replacement or in lieu of. It is something in addition to. So that is an important thing to kind of keep in mind. Now, depending on who the solution provider is, we've actually sort of seen a rather broad range of what it would potentially cost to do an MDL. I think I can say the same thing about a physical credential, depending on how loaded up the credential was with security features and other what I would term bells and whistles.
How could state or local police use this MDL to support businesses to get access to hurricane impacted areas or to restore or repair critical infrastructure? So I guess from a first responder standpoint and perhaps as a means of identifying people who need to have access to secure areas in the case of a storm or some other emergency?
Thank you, Randy. Yeah, that's a great question, and one that has been considered. Right now, at least, and I can speak only for what we do in Florida, we do in disaster situations, we will issue temporary credentials to first responders, power companies, whomever's coming into Florida to help us restore. Hurricane Michael was a great example of this. And in order to do that, we have to go through a litany of things to get information from each company about who they're sending, what they're sending them for, get access through our federal and local and state partners. And MDL will actually streamline that process so that you already have who's supposed to be there and who is supposed to be there for which company. And all you're doing now is issuing the temporary credentials so that they can get into the disaster zones. And that process is much more streamlined, much quicker, and much easier on all the parties involved. So this will make it a much more streamlined process once mass adoption of the mDL is done, because you can actually use the already issued credential that's been issued to the first responder as their entrance into the disaster area. And I hope that answers their question.
Thank you, Mike. We have David Keltz here. We have a technical question on security. Hold on one second. I had it and I lost it. Regarding the unattended use cases, how do you ensure that the person that uses the phone is really who they claim to be with regard to the presentation of the mobile driver's license?
Okay, so in the day one of the ISO standard, there is the expectation that the portrait will be used you can check the signature on the portrait, and a human attendant can take a look at the portrait and take a look at the person and see that they're the same person. So that is the day one mechanism. You could, with this day one mechanism, also take that portrait, and the verifier at their own responsibility, right, could run a biometric check of the face to the person who's standing there. So there are mechanisms by which you could run unattended in day one. And then as we evolve this standard for the next version, we'll include the options for authenticating the user by means of the user's own device. Could be called selfie authentication, or through sort of other mechanisms that as part of the sort of ISO transaction flow. So hopefully that covers how you could do unattended in day one, and that will expand as we put the next version of the standard out.
Thanks, David. Question for Jeff, and if others have information, they could share it as well. A couple people have asked it about what states are currently underway in the form of either implementations or pilots, or are close to being able to issue mobile driver's licenses.
Thanks, Randy, and thanks for that. Thanks for that question. It's a little bit of a complicated answer, and it does kind of go back to something that Mike had mentioned. So when we talk about mDL, and we are talking about the work that has happened in the standards arena, those things that align to that is what the interest has been in, and what we have really been working with. Doesn't mean that there aren't other electronic initiatives that have been undertaken by other jurisdictions that are out there. And the way that I think that this has been best characterized is to say that there will be times where people see needs and that they feel like that they're in a position to do something in meeting them. And in doing so, for that particular need and under those particular circumstances, to feel as though it's worth whatever that investment is. There are a couple of those that are out there, and they have casually been referred to as an mDL because there are some similarities. But as Mike described, unless all of those conditions and those requirements are being met, with the biggest one being conformance to the work that's happened in an ISO, then they're not really an mDL in the sense of how we've been talking about. On AMVA's website, we're in the process of making available a map that shows and details the status of proofs of concepts, pilots, studies, and implementations. And I'll also note that there also is quite a bit of work that is happening outside of North America with other countries that are now undertaking mDL programs, and they too are in those various stages.
Mike, this question is directed to you. You mentioned in your presentation that privacy of the mDL holder and security of the data is considered to be the utmost importance. But for law enforcement, privacy rights often get in the way of effective law enforcement. So how do you balance the two in mobile driver's licenses?
That's a great question, and thank you for the question. So there's two things that we need to keep in mind here when I answer this question. The first is, Jeff brought this forward just a few minutes ago. We are in an optional world with mDL at the moment. So with anyone who has implemented an mDL solution, the person who holds the mDL is also still required by most state law, and in fact, I think it's all state laws, that they carry their physical card, the plastic driver license. So in a law enforcement situation where a person refuses to hand over their mDL or to allow the officer to consume or read the mDL, the officer can ask for the plastic, just like they do today. That's not going to change. So for the foreseeable future, those two options will still be available. In a situation where the officer is asking for your license and you do provide the mDL, that the law enforcement officer is entitled to all of your data, and therefore there will be a part of the mDL solution would be that you would provide that data to the officer in the transaction. Yes, the mDL holder still gets to choose whether or not they do that at a traffic stop. But again, if they choose not to provide the mDL data, they're still required by law, if a law enforcement officer asks, to provide the plastic. So I don't see this precluding. The privacy and security is not precluding the law enforcement officer from doing their job as they normally do today.
Thank you, Mike. David, do mDLs work on all phones? And part two of that is, why is it important that the mDL support multiple digital data interfaces like NFC, Bluetooth, and QR code? David, we're not hearing you if you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about the mute button. So the mechanisms that are supported for the interchange of data, like to set up the connection, which is NFC and QR code, and to transmit the data, again, NFC, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi Wear, and then the online model, which is the internet connection models. All of those mechanisms are available on multiple cell phones, moving very back very far in the history of the sort of hardware. They're supported at the hardware level. There are some operating system changes required, but this should mean in some instances, like Wi-Fi Wear, and in other instances, there are none that are required. So as far as supporting phones, like back in the history of phones, we should be able to roll this out, supporting a very wide range of transmission mechanisms on multiple different devices. And then again, these are as well available on both of the major platforms, plus in some of the other, plus other phone platforms, or all of the major phone platforms. These mechanisms are available on each of them. And then since the platform vendors have been involved in the process of this standardizing these, they also have revisions. And you can see there are some posted public news about identity credential APIs for supporting these. So support should be very wide. The second part of the question, was why it's important to have the multiple different transmission mechanisms. And to me, it's very important to have those because the verifiers will have different scenarios in which they want to obtain the data and trust the data from the mDL. And they've got existing equipment that they've put in place. They have security requirements for whether or not they can be connected to the internet at that point of service. So having the different profiles And really more importantly, having all of the mDLs that roll out, issuers choosing mDLs that support all of these different transaction mechanisms, it sort of encourages the ecosystem, the usage to flourish, and allows the verifiers to choose how they will accept identity.